Hello and welcome to the very first Knowledge Exchange webinar, the subject being persistent identifiers in academia, risk and trust. Just a few housekeeping points first. This event will be recorded and we will share the recording with you after the event as soon as possible. As we are using webinar mode, you cannot be seen as your cameras and microphones are off. If you do have any questions for our speakers, please put these in the Q&A pane so that these can be picked up. Finally, if you have any general comments or technical issues, please do pop a message in the chat pane, which is separate to the Q&A. So, just briefly, we are Knowledge Exchange and we are a collaboration of 6 national organisations within Europe. We do explorative work in the area of open science and beyond, and we bring experts together to identify opportunities and challenges. If you would like to subscribe to our newsletter and keep up to date with the latest news, including future events, you can do so via the link which is now being placed in the chat. I shall now pass you over to Jessica Parland von Essen, who will introduce our first Mentimeter. Thank you, Jessica. Over to you.
Thank you, Priscilla. Welcome on my behalf too. We have some Mentimeter questions for you today, so please, there's a link to the Mentimeter, which is a direct link to the Menti, or you can also point your phone camera to the QR code or go to the menti.com and enter the code 427577973. So I hope that you managed to join. And now first, just a quick question: from which city or other location are you joining? So we are hoping to get a nice word cloud here and get an idea of who is joining us today. Wow, this is really nice. Thank you. Lots of people from the Netherlands, Stockholm. Very nice. I'll just wait a second to let you get on with this. Okay, we have 55 people, I think, here. So, but some of us are organizers. Maybe we don't announce our locations. Okay, so let's go to the next question. So now we would like to ask you once again to tell which is your role. I think you can give several answers. I'm not sure. Other many librarians. Nice. Oh, if you like to share with us what you are, if you are something else, if you are other, that would be really nice. You could, for instance, write it in the chat for us if you want to tell us something about yourself and your role. And then one more questions before we get going with the presentations. So just out of curiosity, which persistent identifiers have you dealt with yourself? Are used or minted or? Many roars, I see. Thank you. This is really, really interesting. I think you can keep writing there. And now I think we will move on to the first speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. So I'd now like to hand you over to our first presenter, who's Pablo de Castro. So Pablo is part of the team of consultants who delivered the February 23 report, The Promise of Persistent Identifiers, Building the Plane as We Fly It, and its 7 associated case studies for the Knowledge Exchange Task and Finish group. Pablo works as open access advocacy librarian at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow. He's a physicist and an expert in open access and research information workflows and management systems. Pablo also serves as secretary for the Eurocris Association to promote collaboration across the research management community. So over to you, Pablo. Thank you.
Pablo, sorry, you're just on mute still.
Yeah, apologies. It should be okay now, hopefully. Thank you. Thanks for the introduction, Priscilla. And yeah, happy to take part in this first Knowledge Exchange webinar as a speaker. I will quickly go through the work a team of us have done around persistent identifiers, analyzing the landscape, and specifically looking into risks and trust-related issues on such landscape. I'll first start by showing the PID graph. As you all know, this is kind of completing this PID graph would be the ultimate goal of the development of the PID landscape. This is the most up-to-date screenshot we have as such for the PID graph as described by the Freya project back in August 2020. And you can see there a number of entities that have already the PIDs. However, we know that things have evolved quite a bit ever since this snapshot was provided by the Freya project. We have now ROR's much expanded ROR coverage. We have Ringgold IDs. We have DOI-based grant IDs. Persistent identifiers for instruments and facilities are starting to come up. We have IGSNs, we have RAIDs also coming up. So the snapshot is clearly evolving quite quickly, and it will continue evolving. The question is, are we able to keep track of these evolving snapshots? It's quite hard to provide the figures, to provide the links between PIDs. It would be really useful to have an up-to-date snapshot of this. The work we've done has tried to provide it, although not with specific figures for each of the entities and the PIDs. There is this sensation, this feeling of building the plane as we fly it. That's the title of the report we have delivered, actually. And yeah, there is this sensation that we are developing new PIDs to be built on top of the existing ones while we're still building the existing ones. So yeah, quite an interesting feeling in this regard. So a summary of the goals for this wider PID work commissioned by the Knowledge Exchange. The main ones were to examine the best possible strategic and operational paths to achieve a well-functioning PID infrastructure for Knowledge Exchange member states and beyond. This was the main one. And then also to specifically explore the risks around the current PID landscape and to try and understand the most important elements of trust in creating this PID infrastructure. I will show, the URL for the report is already there on the slide at the bottom. This is kind of the main outcome of the work we have done, this for consultants under SAIDI code banner. This is composed of a large report, so the kind of summary report for our study. All of those outputs are stored in Zenodo under a CC BY license. There are, on top of the report, there are 7 individual case studies that you have listed on the slide there, specifically looking into author IDs and the superseding of a very early digital author identifier in the Netherlands by the kind of all-encompassing ORCID and ISNI that came afterwards. Then org IDs, the coexistence of RORs, of Ringgold IDs, how the way forward might look like. PIDs for research instruments and facilities, as mentioned, are an emerging PID area, mainly driven by the RDA working group at the moment, although consistently expanding as we speak. We have IGSNs or PIDs for geosamples, also consolidating rather quickly with the help of DataCite. We have the RePEc author service, or the wider RePEc service, RePEc standing for Research Papers in Economics. So it's a very well-established community-driven PID for researchers in economics and in business studies, which kind of remains there despite the fact that we have ORCIDs and RORs and Ringgold IDs around. They still have their own author identification service and affiliation identification service on top of the kind of more widespread ones. We have a 6th case study on failed PIDs and unreliable PID implementations, looking, for instance, at Perl and other cases specifically looking into risks. And then finally, the one that was released as a teaser back in November last year on the key role that research funders are expected to play in the consolidation of the PID landscape by adopting PIDs such as grant IDs themselves and acknowledging the most relevant PIDs out there for their funding workflows. All these outputs, the reports and the 6 case studies were published early in February this year, on top of the teaser case study, as I mentioned, that was published in November last year. This is, in a snapshot, the team behind this work on PIDs for the knowledge exchange in alphabetical order. As you can see, it's 4 of us based in the UK, in Germany, and in France. So the team was able to provide quite an overview of the state of the PID landscape with kind of direct experience in the 4 countries, all of whom are, of course, of the 3 countries, so the UK, Germany, and France are all knowledge exchange member countries. Critically, all 4 of us are institutional advocates as well as consultants. So we know the landscape from the inside, from working at various universities, Strathclyde in my case, Saarland, Humboldt Universität Berlin in the case of Ulrich and Laura, and then Université de Lille for Joachim. So that's an interesting input. On top of the work of the 4 consultants, we've relied on the Knowledge Exchange PID Task and Finish group, which is linked on the URL below and is expanded here so that you can see that we have had quite a lot of support from colleagues in other countries, in other roles as well. All KE member countries are represented on this Task and Finish group for PIDs, Risk and Trust. Some of them are in the call today, I'm happy to say, even many of them, and Gael herself will be the presenter after me. So the study was carried out with a goal of delivering an analysis of the current state of the PID landscape in the 6 Knowledge Exchange member countries, both with a focus on currently existing PID entities, so the best established PIDs right now, so authors, researchers, institutions / organizations, outputs, so publications, data sets, etc., and also with a focus on emerging PIDs, a few of which are listed there, conferences research equipment, facilities, some geosamples as well. The data collection was carried out via a literature study and specifically through a number of interviews with experts in the domain, whose names and affiliations I'll show right away. These interviews fed into the production of these documents I mentioned in the previous slide, so the report and the 7 case studies exploring the issues around risk and trust in the PAD infrastructure. And then there are a set of recommendations for best practice, targeting the various stakeholders we have identified as critical in the implementation of the PAD infrastructure. These recommendations will be the main content of Gael's presentation later. This is, as mentioned, the list of interviewees for gathering evidence to put together this work. As you can see there, again, all 6 KE member countries are represented there in very different roles, as you can see. So you have publishers there, you have institutions, you have funders, kind of national coordination offices, the likes of which compose the knowledge exchange, as it were, technical experts, representatives from PAD service providers. You have the roles of each of the interviewees on the right-hand side of the table, because there was a pre-existing categorization of roles that we have tried to cover as a whole. So from kind of PAD service providers down to PAD users through a number of additional categories. A few selective findings from this work are summarized next quite quickly. PADs, as you all know, are socio-technical infrastructures. We have found that the trust seems to be built on the knowledge of the knowledge and the trust on specific individuals and organizations rather than on the technology they use, because the risks associated with such technology are considered amorphous. The users aren't really aware of all the risks. So if they trust a person or they trust an organization, that will do for them, even if they don't completely understand the technology around the issuing and the maintenance of PADs. These are the PADs that were predominantly mentioned during the interviews, mostly, as you would expect, those that are well established at the moment, the ones that showed up in the Mentimeter, essentially DOIs, ORCID, RORs. And then there are a few emerging PADs as well that were mentioned as listed there. And then standards like URNs or schemes like ARC were also brought up in the interviews. The main benefits for PADs, I'm sure you're all aware of that, are interoperability, value-added services, and the interconnectivity of rich metadata. We have this dichotomy between what the report calls technical versus admin-oriented PADs. Technical being, for instance, geosamples, where researchers are the ones driving the implementation of these PADs for geosamples because they're using them regularly. So they're very bottom-up. As opposite to those, what we call the admin-oriented PADs, such as ORCID, such as RORs, they tend to be top-down, so driven by funders, by institutions, by publishers, and researchers are expected to adopt them at some point, or at least to understand what they are, but not necessarily involved in their issuing, in their production. Key aspects in terms of trust and reliability are both open source and open data. So it's the POSI, the principles for open infrastructure, are seen as very important for counting on a trustworthy infrastructure. Establishing a community of PAD users is seen as a key factor, of course. So it's not just build them and they will come. It's very important to have a kind of permanent conversation with the various roles around PAD, including the end users of the infrastructure. the implementation of PADs requires a strategic analysis. And finally, there is a significant PAD landscape fragmentation, as we have already been able to see, and there are competing initiatives, but this is not necessarily seen as a major issue. Competition may actually help implementing a better PAD landscape. Finally, my last slide kind of summarizes further opportunities for continuing the discussion around PADs. There is talk about perhaps holding a UK core organized PAD, discussing the actual implementation, the technical implementation of PADs. Tomorrow, there's a very interesting webinar that DataCite will be holding on DOIs for research software. You have the snapshot there. Then our team of consultants will be delivering presentations at the UNIS conference in Vigo in Spain, mid-June. And finally, there will be further inputs from the consulting team at the Leibniz Institute Open Science Conference in Germany at the end of June, and at the LIBER conference early in July in Budapest. That's it from me. Thank you very much. I'm happy to answer any questions later. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Pablo. I currently do not see any questions in the Q&A section, but maybe we should give people some time to still have a thought about the presentation and let it sink in. We can also, of course, address the questions at a later point in time in case there are none currently. Okay, no questions currently. We have someone typing something, I guess. So let's see if we have a question there or if we take it a bit later. Well, I think we can, in that case, we can maybe show the Mentimeter that was asked also by a participant.
There is one question.
There is one now, yeah.
Yeah, the question was how to use PIDs in knowledge graphs, and saying, I mean, something like MAG.
So, yeah, I will take the question. Thank you. I mean, the way PADs come into the knowledge graphs is by essentially minting them and having someone who keeps an eye on the whole graph. So this is expected to go into the metadata. There was a presentation of this work earlier this year at the NISO 2023 conference in a session that Gael shared, where it was discussed this issue that many kind of metadata elements right now are free text elements. We should gradually replace a grant number for a funder with a grant ID, with a persistent identifier that is machine readable and that will allow the knowledge graph to be automatically displayed. So this is how they would come in by using them in metadata description of elements. I hope that may have answered the question. Thanks.
Okay, good. Should we now maybe take a look at the Mentimeter, the last question you had there, so to see the final results of that one? So persistent identifiers you have dealt with. I think it didn't change a lot since we last saw it, but clearly and unsurprisingly, I guess, ROR, DOI, ORCIDs come across most strongly.
We have another question in the Q&A.
Yes, I was just about to say, it says, people trust in individuals or organizations, but do we know more about the criteria deemed important by end users?
So yes, thank you for the question. We do indeed know more about this criteria. They are kind of summarized in the report. Perhaps the most important one of those is having contingency plans in place. So if an organization that is managing a given set of PIDs ceases to exist, there needs to be a contingency plan in place to ensure that some other organization will be able to take over without wrecking the existing infrastructure. So those contingency plans are in place sometimes. Again, more info on these in the report, but they're not always in place. And especially for emerging PIDs, it's very important that these sort of risk-related considerations are kept in mind. Thank you.
We now have an
Okay.
Yeah, we now have an open-ended question here for you. If you want to share your thoughts and comments around this, and this will be open also now. Let's see. Consistent use is a really good point. Does this do you have any comments on this, Pablo? Do they feel familiar? Oh, you have to open your mic.
Sorry, yes, I was muted. Apologies. Yeah, of course, these are quite familiar indeed. So there is a bit of a challenge. There is a discussion going on whether researchers need to know about certain PIDs, specifically organization IDs, the RORs and the Ringgold IDs. Are researchers expected to know about this? My answer as an institutional open science advocate would be yes. We need to explain them to them, but some other voices in the discussion say that they don't, that this will be shown to them as a drop-down menu. So what's your affiliation? When you submit your manuscript, you click on an entry on the drop-down menu, and that entry has a hidden ROR behind it, and this is the ROR that will go into the metadata, into the XML code. And they don't necessarily need to know about this. It's an interesting discussion. It's not yet clear what the reaction will be from researchers to this wide range of PIDs that we're expecting them to know about.
Yeah, this is really interesting points. If you have some comments, you can also comment in the chat or through the Menti. Quality. Yeah, wow, many good thoughts here.
Yeah, I think when Gael presents the recommendations later, you will see some suggestions to tackle some of these challenges that are being shown on the screen right now.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe it's Gael's turn, or Priscilla, maybe.
Okay, thank you, Pablo and Jessica. So I'd now like to hand you over to our second presenter, Gael Biquet. And Gael is the director of the ISSN International Centre. Prior to this position, she managed several academic libraries. She defended her PhD in information science in 2011, and Gael published a book about the development of digital libraries in Austria, France, and the UK in 2014. Gael was also chair of ISO TC 46 and documentation from 2014 until 2022, and she's a member of the Knowledge Exchange Group and also of the Europeana Advisory Group. Over to you, Gael. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Priscilla. I will share my screen, and I hope everyone can see my slides. Okay. So just quickly, I want to add that I've been involved in the process of actually drafting the scoping document, and that was the starting point for the report that was presented by Pablo. And for this webinar, our aim is to actually focus on a few recommendations taken from the report, and especially we decided to do that based on the types of organization and that actually attend this webinar, or whose representatives attend this webinar. So we're going to focus on research stakeholders, universities and researchers. So this is the outline of my presentation. I will start, it's based, of course, on the report. I will stress or start with the fact that a national PID policy is really crucial, and I will explain why. Also talk about the role of research performing organizations, of universities in handling or working with PIDs. And then I will talk about how researchers can be involved or get involved with the implementation of PIDs in their daily research activities. So I would say the overarching recommendation taken from the report is that it's important to set up a national PID policy. You know that there are 6 countries actually participating in the knowledge exchange group, and we know some of them have already come up with a national PID policy. So it's important to gather all key stakeholders. As you can see, these stakeholders are funders, research funders, national libraries, research performing organizations or infrastructures, and they need to come together to discuss this strategy and define it, including all identifiers that need to be prioritized. This is really important, and that's the way it was done in certain knowledge exchange countries. Explain also why these identifiers are preferred, what are the purposes of using them, to identify documents, to identify people, instruments, data sets, and also something which is important is how these PIDs interact with the systems. I've seen in the Mentimeter that some attendees were mentioning CRIS systems. They were also talking about, the competition between 2 PIDs. So I think this is the strategy should address this kind of issues and explain also why these PIDs, how they can also interact together. For example, in a PID graph, that's also something that has been mentioned earlier. Another recommendation from the report is to create, the strategy is one thing. Another thing is to create a PID advisory board or a governance body that can actually, define the PID, but make it evolve according to the needs that are identified within the community. This is also important because experts sitting on this advisory board should stay informed regarding initiatives to create new PIDs, but also, and we've seen that in the presentation by Pablo, PIDs may disappear, and there is a case study linked to the report explaining, the failure of some PIDs. So it's important to monitor, let's say, the context or the environment and implement PIDs or be aware of difficulties that these PIDs and the PID service providers may encounter during, the course of their activity. So this is the reason why this advisory board is also important and crucial. The other recommendation is about benchmarking with other national PID strategies And also you may be aware that there are international forums that address this topic. They can be helpful also to just advise on how the policy can evolve or be amended to meet new needs, or to actually check the availability of new PIDs. And Pablo mentioned the fact that these PIDs are socio-technical organization or structures. This is important, to have contacts with the PID service providers as well, to be able to get information, from these structure and what their activities are actually. And of course, communication is also important. So at the national level, there should be much communication around or about this policy and the role of the advisory board. So that's the first. I mean, these recommendations regarding the policy are the most important in the set of recommendations contained in the report. Secondly, I would like to focus on the role of universities. Of course, they are directly involved in the production of scholarly output. And this is the reason why they need to stay tuned with the national PID policy, and define their own policy as a reflection of this national policy. So this is completely, let's say, linked to have both the national PID policy and see how it applies locally in a university. There is also much communication to be done with the researchers, or to train these researchers or help them understand and use PIDs. This is something that is regularly done. There are some examples also of training sessions that are organized in the 6 knowledge exchange country or national universities. And it's also something that needs to be implemented locally to help researchers understand which PIDs they are relevant for their work. I was talking earlier, or I've been talking about current research information systems and institutional repositories. Of course, these systems and these repositories are the first places where PIDs are used. And this is part also of the strategy that needs to be implemented at a university. There are also initiatives coming from researchers, and this is really interesting. As Pablo has said before, it's really interesting to make this distinction between technical PIDs and admin-oriented PIDs. Of course, researchers may be more interested in technical PIDs, and they may learn about initiatives to actually identify some reference in their own research fields, but they must be aware also of admin-oriented PIDs and know the distinction between these two. And last but not least, another recommendation is to get to know the players. That's part of the also what an advisory board could make or could do, like know about the social technical structure of PID service providers. I will end, and this is nearly my last slide, with how researchers can be involved. Well, first of all, they are individuals. They can get PIDs. They can also just know about the various PIDs that have been assigned locally. And what is very important, and there was something mentioned on this issue earlier, interoperability is important, and sometimes this interoperability relies on the PID user. So you may have a local PID, you may have an international PID, because here we're talking about international PIDs. And the interoperability may not be systematic, may not be automatic. So it's important to keep this in mind and see how your IDs can actually interact. What is also very important is to monitor the associated metadata. How much metadata do you want to share with the PID service provider? Can you control it? Can you remove information from your from the record, from the ID that you've created? This is also important to know, let's say, the intricacies of how a PID works. You may be, as a researcher, involved in applications to get some funding. So this is also very important to know about the requirements from funders, from publishers, from your own university or research performing organization, how they want you to complete information in their own systems. Emerging PIDs in your own field, I think this is also very important, and this is something that is already, I suppose, very common for researchers to know about how these different types of information are actually identified, or to be, so that they can circulate or between communities. And last but not least, the PID policy of the institution, should, in a way, recap all these recommendations that are implemented locally. So, as I've already said, I only focused on 3 types of recommendations, and the report contains more recommendations, for research funders, for PID service providers, for publishers. The report also advocates for the creation of a PID federation, and also gives some guidelines to the knowledge exchange group to pursue the work on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Gael. We just had a question in the Q&A, but I believe that Pablo was a bit quicker than I was, so he already came around to answer them.
Yeah, apologies
in
for
that
that.
section.
But
You're too
I'm
fast for
really
me.
happy to discuss it, as Jessica mentioned.
It's more,
Yeah, so
more
many interesting.
more comfortable for me. So
now we have one open question. Any projection toward blockchain, permanent record preservation on chain?
Well, that was something that we discussed when we were drafting the scoping document, and talking about just new kinds of PIDs like DID, decentralized identifier, or other identifiers which are not in a way centralized, that can be created by individuals, for example, directly. So this was a bit too, let's say, a bit out of scope for the report. So the report mentioned, but I will leave Pablo, maybe will give an explanation. So they are mentioned in the report, but it's true it was not the focus in the end that was decided by the team. But it's true, these are some let's say some options or alternatives to the identifiers that we've mentioned.
Yeah, maybe to complement, thank you, Gael. We didn't indeed address decentralized identifiers in the report. They were barely mentioned in the interviews. That also must be said. The main reason they're not mentioned is that they are seen as a little bit of a niche development at the moment. So we focused our analysis on PIDs that are relevant for scholarly communications activity. And these sort of decentralized identifiers haven't yet found a way, as far as I know, in the conversations with research funders, with universities, research centers, with researchers themselves. They seem to be a bit of a niche development limited to the computer science experts at the moment. Perhaps also worth mentioning is the fact that there are initiatives. I only found out about them in some detail yesterday, and this is the reason why they aren't kind of recorded on the report. This is a really swiftly evolving landscape around PID. So it's, 2 weeks after the report is released, the report will already be outdated. So apologies for that. That's kind of partially our fault. The issue around sovereignty of PIDs is becoming increasingly important because, I'm going to post the URL on the chat for you. It may be in Spanish, apologies for that. But there is a whole initiative in Latin America to build a PID infrastructure around ARCs without necessarily relying on the widespread DOIs that sometimes they cannot afford. And who is going to tell them this is wrong, I wonder. So the issue around sovereignty of research infrastructures as a whole is a key topic in these days. I know very well that PID service providers are aware of this because that came up in the conversations with them as part of the interviews. But it will be a very interesting evolution to keep an eye on, because these ARC-based PIDs are indeed connected to blockchain. So this is what they will use to ensure that metadata are preserved. I hope that kind of answers to some extent. Thank you.
Thank you, Pablo and Gael. I think, yeah, indeed, the last question in the Q&A was already answered by Pablo.
Yeah, there's just a request about sharing documents and advice, which we can do later. And in the chat, there's just a bit of a discussion. It's not, there aren't any other questions.
Are there any further questions at all?
In the chat, there might be, not in the Q&A.
Yeah, no, there are no questions, just a bit of discussion about blockchain and DIDs.
And Jessica posted a question. She says, do you have any more information about the W3ID system? Who is managing and governing it? I have noted it, but don't know much about it. So it's a question for anybody, really, if anybody knows anything about this particular system.
Okay.
That was a portion of a question that Pablo did answer in the Q&A. He recommended contacting someone at TIB Hanover.
Yeah, that was a recommendation to contact Stephanie Hagemann at TIB because the question was about, I think there was a typo actually on the question was about research prices. It was written with a C. I understood it was meant to be written with a Z. So about research prices, awards that I'm not aware of. I'm not aware of any initiative aiming to provide PIDs for research prices. But Stephanie in Hanover, she was the lead for this Confident project to issue persistent identifiers for conferences and events. which at the time was quite pioneering. They had funding for their project, so that helps, of course, but she may be able to advise on who to contact or how to address a new area for PADs. Thanks.
And Adam just mentions in the chat that you can add research awards or prizes to your ORCID record, of course. That's a good point.
Any further questions or comments?
In the chat, using ChatGPT, any thoughts?
Well, just for as a joke, you know, it's really interesting when you ask or you request ChatGPT to explain what ISSN is, and actually the ChatGPT comes up with a very interesting reply or explanation. So maybe that's something to start with. You know, just we mentioned DIDs. Maybe we can give it a try and ask ChatGPT to explain what DIDs are, what handles are, and explain also the purposes they are used for. I mean, for which purposes they can be used. So I would say for the time being, that's the only you know, input I can have on this. But that can be a start.
So if I may add briefly, perhaps not ChatGPT, but artificial intelligence might have a role to play in putting together. There was a question about this earlier in the Q&A, putting together the updated snapshots for the PAD graph or the knowledge graph that I mentioned earlier. That is something, because you need to look into so many different places where PAD production is happening right now. That would be an interesting task for artificial intelligence, any kind of artificial intelligence powered mechanism. Thanks.
And one more thing is just PIDs are also worthwhile when the metadata associated with it is curated and good quality. So that could be also an application for artificial intelligence, the comparison between various metadata.
Okay, so we'd just like to thank you all very much for attending our very first webinar and for all of your contributions. And we hope that you found this interesting and useful. We would be very grateful if you could just take a few moments to complete the final Mentimeter question, which you should now have access to. Thank you, Jessica, for that. Your feedback is very important to us. So if you could provide your reflections, your ideas, takeaways from this webinar. So for example, please do let us know what from this webinar you found useful, how you will apply this to your work. I also want to say a very big thank you to our presenters for your excellent presentations and for answering all of the questions. Thank you for that. And all questions and answers will be shared with you all after this webinar as soon as possible, and the recording will also be made available. Finally, I'd just like to say, please do keep an eye on our website and social media channels for details on future webinars. And we do hope to see you soon. And thank you very much once again. And I just invite the speakers if there's anything any final comments you would like to give.
Well, just maybe that I will leave this last question open for a while, so you can take your time and add questions which means I actually won't be showing the thank you slide, which we have prepared, because then it will close the Menti. So, but very nice to have so many participants. Thank you.